Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, those who are with us and those who are remote. My name is Maya Sabatello. I'm an associate professor of medical sciences at Columbia University, and I'm delighted to have this seminar speaker, which is part of the Disability Ethics, Intersectionality, and AI/ML bias. And it's co-sponsored by Columbia's Center for Precision Medicine and Genomics, the Division of Ethics, and the Department of Biomedical Informatics. The seminar speaker is funded by the National Human Genome Research Institute. It is part of an effort to engage in an interdisciplinary dialogue about the experiences of people with disabilities in healthcare, research, and society at large, to think about how existing perceptions, practices, systems, and structures may affect the well-being of this population, and how the disciplines of ethics, medicine, social sciences, and biomedical informatics can support more equitable outcomes for people with disabilities, both at the group level, as well as the intersection of disability and other forms of marginalization, such as gender, race, and ethnicity. For this purpose, we invite speakers to share their work and insight on issues and challenges that arise with regards to people with disabilities in medicine, big data, and emerging technologies. So this is the second year of our operation, and today I'm delighted that Dr. Rua Williams has accepted our invitation to present on her work in this series. So before moving forward to introduce Dr. Williams, just a few housekeeping notes. We do have here a hybrid event. So some of us are here, some of us are remote. We are recording and we have live captioner. And so if you need, you can turn it on your end as well. The structure for the seminar is that the speaker presents for about 45 minutes, followed by Q&A. That we invite from both the audience here who is present as well as from the audience who is remote. If you are in the room, you can just raise your hand. If you're remote, you can post your chat. We can either read and either the speaker, Dr. Williams, or myself will read it out loud. We also circulated attendance here if you want to write your names in, just in terms of being invited to future events. And just again, for future events, we have the next event on Monday, April 1st. At 1 to 2 p.m. and we will host Dr. Rupa Valdez, who will discuss participatory designs in AI. So please pencil that in as well. So now for the reason that we're here today, which is Dr. Williams. And I'd like to introduce her. So Dr. Williams is an assistant professor of user experience design at Purdue University in Indiana. They are a Just Tech Fellow with the Social Science Research Council, where they are investigating disabled people's bodily autonomy and social agency through adaptive and assistive technologies. Dr. Williams is the principal investigator for the Collaboration Lab, which studies interactions between technology design, technology research practices, and disability justice. They deploy feminist and anti-racist approaches to technoscience, critical disability studies, and science and technology studies in the design and evaluation of socio-technical systems. Through their scholarship, they illustrate injustice in technology while simultaneously uplifting marginalized users' own practices of resistance. So today, Dr. Williams will share with us some of her work with a talk titled On Being an Outlier in a World That Worships Optimization. With no further ado, please welcome with me Dr. Williams.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you, Maya, for the introduction. I don't know if I'm used to being introduced. I want to show the captions on this screen, just so that people in the room can see them technically. It should be working?
I think that should be working.
Okay.
But we don't see it.
They're not over here? No, I see them here, which is not helpful.
Oh, we see them here though.
Here, I brought them. It's fine.
You brought them up? Okay, great.
Okay, there now. All right. I'm Rua Williams, and I don't have to tell you about myself because Maya did it, and that was my plan for this slide. So the only thing that Maya didn't tell you was that I am very loud on the internet, and my handle in multiple platforms is Fractal Echo. So is that going to work? Can I get buttons to go clicky clicky? Okay, hold on. Is that okay? Sorry. Oh no. Okay, it's just very slow. So I'm actually going to like make the audience talk to me, which is, I know it's really terrible and I'm so cruel, But I wanted to ask first before we get into this, who who knows anything about King Solomon and would like to tell me what you know about King Solomon? Yes.
Sorry about baby.
Yeah, so the baby story is the story that everybody knows, and I will be talking about the baby story later. It's true. Does anybody know anything else? I'll tell it later. It's going to be later. But does anybody know any other stories of King Solomon? Okay, cool. I was just checking because everybody kind of knows the baby story, but you know, King Solomon is revered and renowned for his wisdom and judiciousness, but he's a complex character and he's actually present in the texts of multiple religions. So he's in Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and also Baha'i. And so he has some historic veracity, but largely he's used as a literary, moral, and philosophical device. One story that is less known is that the Queen of Sheba came to visit him because she wanted to understand the nature of his wisdom. And so she presented him with multiple riddles, but one of the tests that she presented him with was she put in a room 2 flowers. And she said, one of these flowers is real, and the other flower is made up of precious gems. And his task was to figure out which one was which. So he inspects these flowers and they both look identical. They both look extremely like real flowers. He looks at the first flower and he sniffs it and it has a fragrance. And he goes, ah, this must be the flower. But then he goes to the other flower and it also has a smell. So that's not going to work. And then he notices that there's on one flower, there's a drop of dew. And he goes, aha, so it must be this one because fake flower wouldn't have dew. But he goes to the other flower and it also has a drop of dew in the exact same spot. So that's not going to work. He starts to get kind of frustrated with himself. And so he takes a deep breath and he walks over to the window and he considers things for a while and he opens the window. And when he opens the window, a bee flies in and lands on a flower. And he goes, oh, okay, so that's the real flower because the bee landed on it. So like a frustrated classification algorithm, King Solomon was ready to misclassify based on a high logical or statistical probability. But with additional context, he's able to actually make the right determination. So the bee will be important later. And so this is, you see on the screen here, an image of King Solomon painted by Simon Solomon in 1881. I'm sorry, I'm afraid that the slides are not very responsive. Okay, so first, I want to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page about what we're talking about when we talk about AI, because we know that AI stands for artificial intelligence, and we know that there are a bunch of technical and theoretical debates about the appropriateness of this term and whether or not it's accurate or reasonable. But for lack of a better term, the AI boom that we're experiencing right now is dominated by a specific set of techniques for algorithmic classification and prediction known as machine learning. And so machine learning applications are, in concise terms, collections of statistical models applied to large data sets which produce inferences about a particular condition or case. So a better term for understanding what AI is and what it does is algorithmic inferences. So proponents of AI make many promises, and you can see here on the screen multiple examples of these promises that are constantly advertised to me on Twitter. For example, that AI will liberate us from menial clerical labor, that AI will make us faster, smarter, and more profitable, that AI will write better emails and rapidly build effective marketing materials, AI will solve complex logistical problems and help us make data-driven decisions. AI will give us faster diagnostics, more effective medicines, and targeted treatments. The promises are endless. You can even talk to Jesus because of AI, which is a choice you can make. So as an aside, many of the examples that we're really talking about in the past few months have been generative AI, but that's not really what I'm talking about today. I am very well known, I guess, accidentally for complaining about generative AI loudly on the internet. And so I think that many people think maybe that's all that I'm talking about, but actually most of my scientific or scholarly literature is about the predictive kind of AI, the kind most often used in genetics and biomedical research. And so some past examples are Oh No, Not Another Trolley, which is a paper that I wrote about how computer science students react to scenarios of algorithmic decision-making in medical care. And another one called Only the Old and Sick Will Die, which is about how data visualization can be used to support various politically motivated public health decisions. Sorry, I needed that note. So I just wanted to remind everyone that this predictive AI is used not just in biomedical research and healthcare, but also our judicial system, finance, public policy, and education. And so I think a lot of people are familiar with, at this point, examples of discrimination in AI. And I'm sorry, I wanted to ask you another question. And I have to find it because I wrote them on the plane. Okay, I'm going to do that in a second. So we're familiar with these examples of discrimination in AI, and I think there's been some acknowledgement that there can be disproportionate, discriminatory, or even fatal consequences for these systems for marginalized people. I am curious about from the audience about what examples you might have on your mind about examples of bias and discrimination in AI related to maybe the field that you study or care about. You can do it. I'm checking the chat too, by the way.
So I think something that a lot of us think about when we think about bias is specifically bias of the model, like bias as measured by model performance. So does the model perform worse on certain subgroups than others?
So to rephrase that for the mic, you often think about the bias as measured by the model, where it's determining whether or not decisions are being made in sort of an unbalanced way for different populations of people based on some kind of demographic identifier. Yeah, yeah. Yes.
Something that I think about in my work is about how sometimes these data science models, AI predictive models, overly simplify and flatten the human experience and are used to predict something maybe binary, maybe categorical, that is probably much more rich embodied experience that can't necessarily be captured by data, and then doesn't have any transparency about what's used in that model or the limitations of that model.
Yes, absolutely. And so to rephrase for the mic, just in case, because I'm not really sure how well it's getting the audience in here, that sometimes with large data sets, these traits that are used to build, like in my head, I'm trying to say like struct or class, and that's not useful for everybody in I'm doing programming words, sorry. These traits that are built into the model, like identifying aspects of a person and using that to calculate some kind of prediction about an outcome, can be flattening. And I think a very good example is in medical care. If you're looking at data that is basing its predictions on your classification as male or female, and the person is actually transgender and therefore doesn't quite match neither the biological nor the socioeconomic ideal or normate of that anymore. Or maybe they have PCOS, or they have some other kind of endocrine condition that makes them not a norm, or they makes them an outlier in their supposed gender, then that calculation is not going to be relevant, let alone accurate. So other examples of this we see in facial recognition. We have seen problems from an inability to distinguish non-white faces from each other, to a predisposition to identify Black faces as animals, to a tendency to misclassify Black and brown people as matches to criminal databases, all the way down to seemingly mundane difficulties for people trying to use their face as a key to their phone. There have been cases of algorithmic discrimination in finance, where women are denied credit or given lower limits and higher interest rates. And a lot of this is based upon historical data, forgetting the fact that women were not allowed to have credit cards until like the 70s or even 80s, depending on where you were, and that women could not have mortgages until after the mid-60s. And so that this would influence these statistical classifications of what kind of debt a woman would reasonably be able to take on. And we have seen that diagnostic practices discriminate against marginalized people in part because of how physicians are educated. And yet we built algorithmic supports, which include the very same data that has unsuccessfully trained our physicians. And we see the very same racial discrimination patterns in algorithmic diagnostics. So a very clear example of this is in algorithmic like image processing of skin cancers, where the data sets that physicians are trained on often only include white skin, and then the databases that the algorithms are trained on are also dominated by photographs of white skin, and they just don't work accurately for other skin types. And so there's more to this. It starts to get grimmer from here, actually. So medical ethics panels, and that these are boards that are often located within every hospital that make decisions about major medical procedures. They're now able to use algorithmic supports to justify inequitable decisions about transplant and treatment opportunities for disabled people. So before, the panel would just say, we can't give your son a heart because he's intellectually disabled, and that is indeed a thing that they will do. Now they can say the algorithm predicts a low chance of success because people like your son don't live very long. Never mind the fact that the lower life expectancy for disabled people is a direct result of medical discrimination and neglect. So we're basing our decisions about extreme measures and surgeries for people with disabilities on data that itself includes the idea that they're naturally predisposed to death, but they're actually not naturally predisposed to dying sooner. We kill them. So so when we ask a statistical aggregate to infer probabilities of human action, human worth, and human life, that model will harm the most vulnerable every time. These are people whom, when considered as data points, represent outliers, unexpected, inconvenient, or otherwise neglected exceptions or eccentricities to the neat rule of parametric normality. Damian Patrick Williams describes the terms that we have agreed to as a society in order to play with AI. That these systems are built on data which includes historic and contemporary legacies of systemic racism, ableism, and gendered violence, and that these systems are built to solve problems or offer answers to questions which reflect an ongoing cultural ignorance about the nature of those problems or the motivations behind those questions. It's this second term that people seem the most committed to ignoring. When we discuss equity and fairness in algorithmic decision-making support systems, we often fixate on data curation, cleaning, debiasing, non-discrimination. So methodological fixes. Never mind that many of these methods result in little more than a naive, apolitical, colorblind approach to fairness. I kind of buried the lead there. I actually wanted to ask you, what kinds of examples of methodological debiasing are you aware of? Yes.
Question, by methodological, you mean like within the model or like computationally?
Yeah, so either through manipulating the data, curating the data, or through some kind of algorithmic weighting or adjustment, to not give away all the words. Yeah.
I think more about like auditing afterwards,
Yes.
probably like, what's the, is it not a composite score? I'm sure you'll tell us.
Yeah, so that is actually something that happens. They'll build a model and then they'll test it for bias after the fact. And then they'll identify places where bias is occurring, and they'll try to create some kind of weighted correction to that, so that the same data and the same math is being used. They're just sort of adding some scalars in there in a few places.
Yeah, I mean, the one I'm aware of to do that is like propensity score as well can be,
Yeah,
there,
the propensity score, yeah. And so there are many ways. Sometimes we sort of try to balance the data set so that we represent underrepresented people more. There's even a famous case when we were having trouble with the facial recognition unlockers, where I no longer remember if it was Google or Apple. One of them went out and were giving homeless people $5 to have their faces scanned to increase the amount of Black and brown people in their database. Yep, that was the thing that they did. And that same database gets sold to the police for stuff. So that's great. Yeah, so I'm not really interested or excited about methods which would make it more fair, which would make more fair decisions about selection for processing through a meat grinder. And so I really want to be clear about the reality and urgency of these problems. Algorithmic decision-making supports are already present in our everyday lives and are quite literally being used to accelerate disabled death. So I think that we, even now with ChatGPT breathing down our necks, are used to thinking about these advancements in AI for healthcare as something that's coming in the future. But these very same methods are already embedded in insurance determinations and in sort of like medical treatment plan support technologies. And so, oops, I don't know what that was. I want to not click the wrong buttons and only click the correct buttons. It's too bad. So in medicine in particular, these kinds of technologies are already built into the risk benefit profit calculations that insurance companies are using. And these algorithmic inferences are engaging in sort of self-fulfilling prophecies. They lead decision makers to deny care to people because of their classification as disabled. Carrie Ann Lucas is the woman in this slide on the right. She has very bright lipstick on and blue cat eye glasses, and she's wearing a green and blue outfit, and she has a trach ventilator. She was a lawyer, a disability activist, and adoptive mother to 4 disabled children. She was the founder of Disabled Parent Rights, an organization that fights for the parenting rights of disabled people. For more context on that, it is very easy and common for Child Protective Services to be involved in cases where parents are disabled and disproportionately they remove children from that home, just based on the disability. In 2018, United Healthcare denied her doctor's orders for a specific antibiotic that she needed to fight an infection, forcing her to take a less effective drug that she was allergic to. She wrote at the time about this and basically predicted that this would kill her eventually, and that it would cost the medical establishment at least $100,000 to watch her die. She passed away in February of 2019 due to complications from this decision. And I can't really describe for you what it's like to watch someone who you've spoken to privately predict their own death publicly on the internet and then like watch it happen over a few months. Bill Peace is the man in the middle here. He was a bioethicist a cultural anthropologist and faculty at Syracuse University. He was well known for his scholarly work criticizing the decisions by the Ethical Review Board on the Ashley X case, which was a case of a disabled child whose parents wanted to have her surgically altered so that she would never experience puberty because they felt it would be easier for them to manage her in adulthood if she wasn't biologically an adult, and they agreed. And Bill Peace and many other disabled scholars took issue with the implications of that case. He was a full-time wheelchair user, and in 2010, he contracted a pressure sore, and doctors recommended they stop treatment and provide end-of-life care. Somebody I had never met determined my life wasn't worth living. This is a quote from Bill Peace. He survived that sore and continued his scholarship and his activism, and he lived to mourn his friend, Carrie Ann Lucas. But he also passed away in 2019 from insufficient wound care. Michael Hickson is the man on the left. He was a father and a husband, and he was disabled and Black. He was admitted to a hospital in Texas with COVID in the summer of 2019. The medical team determined that treatment would not result in a sufficient quality of life and denied him medical intervention. It should be stated that his baseline was below their standard of quality of life. So he entered the hospital with literally no chance in their eyes. Despite the fact that, like, without COVID, his regular waking every day, happy existence was regarded as not sufficient to justify care. So not only did they deny him access to a ventilator, but they actually also denied him hydration and food. And these are the very same methods of euthanasia deployed against disabled people in Nazi Germany under Action T4. So for Carrie Ann, Bill, Michael, and all other disabled people, I'm asking, how can machine learning protect us from the establishment's belief that we are better off dead? Integrations of AI into medicine rely on histories of ableist, racist, eugenicist protocols, procedures, and data. Yet no amount of data doctoring will change the fact that we are asking AI eugenicist questions to which there are only eugenicist answers. Like all human intellectual and cultural pursuits, AI can neither be apolitical nor ahistorical. We must account for our eugenicist past and present when designing and deploying AI in medicine, Justin, finance, Justin. I hope there's a Justin in the room. That'd be great. Medicine, justice, finance, and all socio-political domains. We have to face this head on. We cannot turn away. So many proponents of AI and other optimists, like Elon stands, I guess, will readily acknowledge these problems, and they often dismiss critique because they consider these problems to be exceptions or flukes. They believe that these problems can be fixed with just the right methodological tweaks. There's this pervasive and quite conceited belief that the motivations for building these systems is good, that the purpose of these systems is good, that AI developers and researchers believe that they want to do good and that therefore they are doing good. So I wanted to ask the audience, what have been some of your reactions to the critiques of AI in biomedicine and other kinds of medical research? I mean, maybe there's just a bunch of AI haters in the room. I don't know. But what are some of the reactions of your peers if you're not into defending AI? You can do it. I'm not moving on until somebody gives me one. Yes.
I guess like at least within the context of like that you can potentially try to capture like domain expert kind of insight in the ways that like data gets stored and represented just computationally. So like perhaps there's a way to apply that either to some kind of different area like the disability realm or the medical realm, where there's additional like maybe not context, but like additional insight that can reflect human reasoning at a more like holistic level. That's just like an initial kind of stuff about it.
So let me rephrase that for the mic and see if I understood you.
Sure.
That one of the arguments is that even if you were to consult a panel of experts, that's not an aggregate of all the available experts, whereas a large language model theoretically might contain the knowledge of many more experts and therefore would give you some kind of insights beyond what the people that you were physically capable of consulting could give you.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think there's nuance with that, obviously. but
Yeah.
That's kind of the general, I guess, idea.
Yeah.
There's also a comment here by Clint Ryan. They seem generally baffled that anyone would identify real problems within magical computer minds.
Yes. So I'll read the message in the chat also in case, because I don't know if it's reaching you or not. So they being tech bros, I'm assuming, seem genuinely baffled that anyone would identify real problems with these magical computer minds. And this kind of brings us to the overwhelming naivety that I witness in the tech sector related to these technologies. But I have another little chat in here I want to look at real quick before I move on. But if I push the wrong button, it's going to move us to a picture of a demon and I'm not ready yet. No, I got it. So I don't feel positively about AI, says Emily Reynolds, but I was at AxCon, an accessibility conference last week as a accessibility scientist. Gross. Sorry, we can talk about that later. And there were several sessions on how AI, specifically LLMs, large language models, will drastically improve services like automatic captioning and image description. It was the first time I felt I had to acknowledge that there were applications for AI that might not be innately ableist. And in the QA, we might be able to talk about some of those nuances of the large language models for sure. But I am targeting my critique at predictive stuff today. Yes. Okay. So Hannah Johnson says they get offended because pointing out there is an issue with the technology they use implies their personal morals are at fault. And this is exactly what I'm going to talk about next. So,
There's one more comment which is, are those gains worth the exploitation of all the people whose work was ripped off to generate models?
yes. So I'm going to save that for Q&A, but I also hate generative LLMs, as you know from my Twitter. So common practices of technology development have this really overwhelming naivety. Alberto Toscano calls this a culture of abstraction. He argues that logical abstraction, which is core to computer science and other scientific analysis, influences how we perceive real-world phenomena. This abstraction away from the particular and toward idealized representations produces and sustains apolitical conceits in science and technology. We are led to believe that if we can just de-bias the data and build in logical controls for non-discrimination, the techno-utopia will arrive and the returns will come pouring in. The argument here is that these adverse consequences are unintended. The assumption is that the intention of algorithmic inference systems is always good, beneficent, benevolent, innovative progress. But Stafford Beer gave us an effective analytical tool to evaluate a system without getting caught up into arguments about intent. This tool is called PosseWid, and it stands for the purpose of a system is what it does. For disabled people, it's been viscerally and fatally clear that the purpose of algorithmic inference in medical care, benefits determination, and public health decisions is to accelerate disabled death. Just to go over PosseWid again, to make sure that I didn't miss the part where I made it make sense. No, you don't need to see that yet. Okay. So this purpose is driven by intensive charity, social equality, and progress, but it's masked by unexamined meta-eugenic cultural discourses, which assert that disabled life is inherently unbearable and inoptimal. To briefly describe meta-eugenics, this is a term which helps us understand when we think that eugenics as a movement is over, and we are unable to recognize it circulating in everyday discourse and attitude and public policy decision-making. This meta-eugenics helps us understand that this is a sustained cultural rhetoric that we have not been able to abolish, even though we officially decry eugenics as a failed experiment and a terrible, terrible thing. So to better explain this purpose of a system issue, I want to move to understanding the nature of a system. So we have these complicated reactions to these unexpected outcomes in AI and machine learning. And Damian Patrick Williams argues that this is in part because we lack appropriate metaphors for understanding what algorithmic inferences really are. So the image here is from an illuminated manuscript, and the script is Arabic, and it's showing an image of a jinn, which oftentimes in Christianity is interpreted to be demon and is sort of unilaterally described as evil, but that's not really accurate. So in classical legend, jinn are neither good nor evil. They're spirits which are ambivalent, akin to nature. Rain can water crops and it can flood streets. So when summoned, a jinn does precisely what it is told to do, whether or not you understand what you truly asked of it. So just like humans in legend, when we are confronted with unintended consequences, we want to blame the jinn for being a trickster and may even call it evil. Intent is laden with moral valence. And like our guest, whose name is in the chat, it's just a bunch of A's, sorry. Also mood. So people panic when it is implied that they may be immoral, or that their moral intent has had immoral consequences. We don't need to concern ourselves with intent. Whether the intent of a system is just is irrelevant. Its premise, its specifications, its data, its methods, its outputs, and its impact, taken together, show us what that system does. And what a system does, once analyzed, automatically becomes its purpose if that system is allowed to continue. So the purpose of a system is what it does. It does not matter what you wanted it to do. It did exactly what you told it to do. So, intent can get in the way of understanding a system's real impact, but we still need to understand why we keep building systems with such horrifying consequences. So here too, intent is not quite the correct target for analysis. We might intend a system to give us faster, more accurate insights to support more effective choices, but what motivates us to turn to machine learning to build that system? Why do we keep doing this over and over again? Again, it's the promises of AI that have driven this motivation. AI has promised fast, consistent, clever, actionable answers to inordinately complex questions. But most importantly, it has promised these results can manifest ethereally without the labor and discernment of humans. Put simply, it has promised to take complexity and the responsibility for that complexity out of our hands. A quote from Damian Patrick Williams in his piece, Any Sufficiently Transparent Magic is, quote, "Hype allows AI proponents to claim that they have built something, A, of great power, and B, over which they have no responsibility or control," end quote. So just as earlier we described computer science as vulnerable to a culture of abstraction, I am arguing that our society is also vulnerable to a culture of abdication. Our desire for optimization and productivity drives us to abdicate effort and skill in exchange for rapidity. Our discomfort with complexity, nuance, particularity, and relation, our discomfort with the extremely difficult medical decisions that have to happen every minute of every day, drives a desire to defer to some other power for justifying decisions with material and mortal consequences. We still keep the human in the loop, and we always argue that there's a human ultimately making these decisions. but we still make the decisions that the machine told us to. We are desperately looking to an ethereal digital demigod for assurance that we are making the correct moral and ethical choice. And so this brings me back to Solomon. So this desire behind these systems has been to abdicate the responsibility of complexity to some other power, to beg for wisdom without experience, to barter bits for judgment without the messiness of relation. I'm arguing that we may be accidentally summoning jinn and struggling with these consequences, but it's possible that we're really trying to summon King Solomon himself. So the famous story of Solomon that was mentioned earlier is the baby story. Okay, so there's two women that come to Solomon's court, and they each claim to be the mother of an infant. There was nobody around when the children were born, and the next morning one of the children was dead, and there's arguments over whether or not the body of the babies were swapped, and there seems to be no witnesses, so it's just these two women's word against each other. And so King Solomon deliberates for a moment, and he says, okay, well, we'll cut the baby in half from the top of the head all the way down to the groin, and each mother can have a half. That's obviously horrific. And one of the mothers shouts, no, never mind. She can have the baby. She would rather her child live than obtain possession of half his corpse. So when she makes this decision to give up her son in order to keep him alive, that's when Solomon decides that that's the true mother, and she gets to take the baby home. So sometimes I think we've built a digital Solomon, and when he tells us to cut the baby in half, we all shrug and say, okay. We're not afraid to pass judgment, but we are afraid to bear the responsibility of it. So there's another story about Solomon that we don't tell as often because it clashes with this characterization of Solomon as inherently and infallibly wise. And this is the story of Solomon and the king of the jinn, Asmodeus. So I'm not giving you the whole backstory, but he has a signet ring that allows him to summon jinn. Okay, he's got this ring, he's got power over the jinn. And he uses this to summon them all forth, and he asks them about their nature and about what they can do and about their weaknesses. And he uses them to help him build a temple. And eventually he is looking for something to build his temple, and everybody keeps telling him, oh, I don't have it, but so-and-so has it. And then he finally gets to the king of the jinn, Asmodeus. And through some very funny story involving making a demon drunk, he captures Asmodeus. And he has Asmodeus help him build his temple. And when he's finished, King Solomon thinks to himself, and he says out loud to Asmodeus, how is it that you're so powerful when I've been able to control you like this? And Asmodeus says, give me your ring and I'll show you. And for some reason, Solomon's like, sure, buddy. And he gives him the ring, and Asmodeus flings him 400 miles out of Jerusalem. And he has to walk back as a beggar to reclaim his kingdom, where Asmodeus is posing as him. And that's the rest of the story. The point of the story is he just gives the ring to the king of the jinn. And how could such a wise man make such a mistake? But Solomon in Islam is a prophet, and prophets are complex human characters. They are meant to teach. They're not meant to be infallible. That teaching can come through their failures just as often as their successes. So when King Solomon teaches us wisdom, he demonstrates his wisdom through his relationships to nature, like the bee, and to humanity, like his understanding that a mother would rather lose her son than to see him murdered. When he teaches us against foolishness, he demonstrates that foolishness through an uncritical obedience to a power he does not understand. So when it comes to algorithmic inferences, there are two lessons I want us to learn. First, we must learn to contextualize these inferences with the real lived consequences of the decisions and actions they support us to make. We must be more attentive to what we think of as the unintended oopsies, and we must notice them as actually the core purpose of these systems. And second, we must learn to ask different questions. King Solomon does not teach us to ask, who is the real mother, but who cares for this child? He does not teach us to ask, what is the real flower, but which flower sustains nature? Which flower invites the bee? And I'll save this for the QA, but I'm often accused of being a Luddite or a hater. And I'm not so deluded into thinking I can get anybody to stop building these things, but what I hope is that I can get people to start asking different questions, wiser questions. So what would it mean to turn our math around? And rather than looking to big data to find solutions to hegemonically defined problems, what if we used it to find the catalysts of injustice? What if we privileged the outlier and asked ourselves, what are the conditions in which the outlier is culled? And once we find that, once we find the pruning mechanism, we dismantle it. And so my last question for you to lead into QA is, what are some of the questions that you're asking? What are some of the questions that you want AI to answer for you? The end. Yeah. Okay. You can either answer my question or ask me your own question. And online people, I see the chat, so you can throw down in there too.
So one of the issues is, of course, that in order to get to that initial structure and design that is different, the entire system has to change. How do you go about doing that when the system is quite stable?
So to hold on a second. I just want the captioner to know that she's typing into the direct messages. Although it did show me that the mic could hear you, so that's good. So the question is about, like, how do we get to the part where we're asking different questions when the questions are based in the system and the system seems relatively stable? That's a whole other talk, but we have really cultivated a sense of hopelessness against, like, we recognized and began to define and articulate this idea of systemic injustice. And in doing so, sometimes we then displace injustice into this realm of, like, basically the spiritual, this idea that it's being driven by unseen forces and it can't be stopped. It's still people. It's still people who wake up every day and make choices, and you're one of those people. And sometimes the choice that you make is to yell at somebody who has more power than you, and there are consequences to that. And you have to do the balance of, like, okay, am I able to go home and live in my mom's basement, or am I going to die if I lose this job? Then you make that choice and you say what you can or not, right? But we can't let this idea that these systems are huge and immovable, like the idea that basically all of my problems are the medical industrial complex, can't lead me to despair. I think that's Miriam Kaba. This is, let this radicalize you and not lead you to despair. Or if that's not Miriam Kaba talks about it. I'm sorry that I don't know the specific citation for that one. But that's my answer to your question.
And I think we're building off of that. My question is always, how do we incentivize this change? If we are, especially as emerging scholars, willing to do this critical work, if we are willing to put our careers on the line for these things, sometimes I think it's hard to get hired and, you know, hard to argue for being allowed to do very different projects, get these projects funded, get these projects published, things like that. And so how do we, as junior scholars, with privilege of being at Columbia, but with the disadvantage of being extremely green, how do we address the lack of incentive? It's the status quo is being upheld for reasons that it's valuable and profitable for many people. And so there is no incentive to orient towards justice, even if we ourselves are willing to put in that work and put in that effort and not, you know, take offense that our moral qualms are being, you know, in question, things like that. So my question is about incentives.
Yeah, well, try not to think about how can you incentivize people with structural power over you, because Let's bring it back to everyday practices that you as a person can take as a junior research assistant in some lab somewhere, right? You're working on a project that your PI has and it's funded, and you realize that some of the premises of this study have built-in flaws based on these unexamined biases. You know, you can bring that up and back it up with research, but also immediately bring the correction to the protocol that would account for that. How can you turn this very same study from this flawed premise into something that actually demonstrates the flaw in the premise? And then that means that your results and the publishing that happens after that is actually based on this idea that we noticed a flaw in the premise. And now we have this understanding of where that comes from and what the effects of that flawed insight is. Now, obviously, there are some PIs for which that would induce rage. And I don't know what to tell you. Some of the people that y'all work for are bad people and you should run. But for the most part, if you're like, here's some science and I want to also try to contextualize the findings in this way, there are many PIs which would be excited about that because in the very basis sense, it equals another publication that wasn't going to happen before. I don't know if that helps, but like try to think about that every day, the little shit that you do every day. If you can think in that realm, you get less depressed about the hopelessness. Yes.
Perhaps I'm asking this naively, but how would pointing out those flaws be different than peer critique?
Well, when it's a junior RA to the PI, I don't, you know, there's like attitudes involved. But peer critique in this particular domain doesn't work very well because your peers have the same unexamined biases and flawed premises that you do. And so we send these studies out and the same 3 people review them and they don't know that you're not paying attention to the social determinants of health or that you're misusing the social determinants of health. Like they don't know that.
So in the same way that many journals may require an additional statistical review, you know, are there some solutions that you think could, you know, get us a little bit to a better state?
There is a definite need for reform in the review process. Like there are not ethical considerations in review. There have been some calls for it, and particularly in computer science, there was a report released called "It's Time to Do Something." It was by like 12 authors from the Association of Computing Machinery's Future of Computing Academy, and they talked about how ethical evaluation should be in the review process, and that this should be above and beyond assuming that because the IRB approved a protocol that everything is like cool, that you should be doing ethical evaluation, not just of the specific protocol, but the social and societal impacts that the system could have, in the same way that you address limitations in a study, that you address the possible consequences of this research should it be taken up in X way or Y way. Now that call has been made, but it doesn't happen. And I even wrote a paper critiquing the call because they assume that everybody has the requisite experience and knowledge to make that evaluation of the societal consequences. But as they showed in their very own paper, they had an assessment of, let's say a technology would revolutionize personal care such that disabled people would need fewer personal care hours. And the consequences that they highlighted were decreased social opportunities for the disabled person, barf, and decreased job opportunities for personal care assistants. But that is not actually the problem with that system. The system's problem, the more you integrate this IoT Skynet shit into daily care of disabled people, the more you have them constantly surveilled and controlled, and basically living in an institution that instead of brick walls is controlled by Wi-Fi networks. Like, you can't evaluate the ethical consequences of a system if you don't have meaningful experience and relationships with people in the affected group. And that's a whole other thing about how we fail to form relationships across a diversity of people. Yes.
This is sort of in relation to that, something that we've talked about a little bit in the department is this idea of citizen science, and specifically in the realm of medicine, a lot of what that looks like is disabled people, people with chronic illnesses, etc., kind of finding ways to take charge of the science that's happening. And so I was wondering if you have thoughts on how we can do that better at like an institutional level as opposed to like a single PI, a single lab or something like that.
Yeah, so I had a minor in fisheries and aquatic sciences, and I love citizen science. People would go out in their boats and they would give us water quality measurements, and it was fantastic. Citizen science is great, but there are also problems with the way that it gets taken up, and there are nuances there. So one of the things that often happens in participatory design is that we like frame something as participatory, but we've already controlled the inquiry. We've already controlled what we think the problem is. And you bring people into the room and you tell them, how would you solve this problem? And they're like, well, I want my $25, so I guess I would solve it like this, even though that's not my problem. And so the reason I go in that direction is that when it comes to citizen science and disabled people, we're all just trying to not die, like literally every day. People's full-time jobs is trying to get the insurance company to not murder them. Like they spend all day making phone calls and coordinating care for themselves and their loved ones. It's all day. They can't participate in your citizen science. They're persistently evading murder, like all day. So what you do see instead is citizen resistance. So an example of this would be the Power to Live movement, which happened in the California area during the PG&E fires. The disabled people were coordinating evacuations, supply delivery, moving people into places that had power because they have equipment that needs power and they lost the power. And these were rolling brownouts with no warning. So they're like driving all over the place and coordinating care. When COVID came, disabled people led the pod movement, although people did weird things with that and didn't take it seriously. And it turned into like a weird hippie thing. So disabled people, when they're not just busy trying not to get murdered, are very good at mutual aid. And I think there's way more mutual aid than there is citizen science, because sometimes it doesn't really do any good to collect the data and show you, right? Like, now that's not to say it's not happening. It absolutely is. There are people that are collecting this data. There's people out there making their own COVID dashboards and explaining to you like why our public health decisions are wrong, right? That is happening, but we're not recognizing it as citizen science. We're recognizing it as like wackos on the internet. Like we're not identifying disabled people as capable of that kind of movement. And so they're doing it on their own, and we're not, as academics, recognizing it because we didn't fund it. I don't know.
All right, I think we're.
Yeah, we are. It's a 2 exactly.
Yeah.
So let me just conclude. Thank you so much. That was really great, interesting. I think some food for thought, hopefully. I want to thank, of course, Dr. Williams for her talk. And I want to thank everyone who's helped in organizing this event, including Pooja, Apara, and Adrian. The Justice Informatics at the department, as well as the diversity, equity, and inclusion groups who've been involved in organizing it, and all the other people behind the scenes, Anna Abreu from CPMG and David Lamb for the Division of Ethics. So thank you, everyone. And we can continue a little bit for the chat here, but thank you also everyone who's attended remotely. We'll have more sessions in the future. Thank you.